going to take just a few minutes today in the studio here at Waycross to talk about the history of the city of Forest Park. We have in our studio from the Forest Park Historical Society, Brandon Wier, and also Willie McGriff. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
I hear little bits about the history of Forest Park. I've never heard it told as an entire story, so I'm really looking forward to finding out more. And the first thing I think I want to talk about is, how old is Forest Park?
1956 was the year that we were started with the dedication ceremony in that year with Marvin Warner and Joe Cantor, the developers of the property that they had purchased into for building a community of new homes.
And how did it then become an idea that this is not just going to be a community for new homes, this is going to be a separate city?
How did that happen? Well, there was an interesting provocation for formation of the village by incorporating in 1961. That provocation came from an attempt to annex certain property of ours, of that area. Before incorporation, that was the site where the Union Central Insurance Company built its offices and thereby created a revenue stream for whichever municipality might have its boundaries include that. So Green Hills stimulated an interest in incorporation by proposing to annex that property.
Okay, so there was a moment where Forest Park was almost North Green Hills.
Yes.
Okay. Then who was the driving force behind it becoming Forest Park then?
Well, there were a number of civic leaders, among them a person named John Lessick and another one, Mel Williams, and Frank Von Hagen. Mel Williams was the chief instigator for the effort to incorporate. And he built a program of soliciting voters and informing voters of the threat and the need for a sort of a preliminary expression of interest. And he found that among people who had only just come since 1956. There was no one in this area at all prior to 56. So 5 years later, the threat of annexation of important revenue generating property was the provocation.
And the both of you are very much part of this history.
Oh, yes.
In different ways. And I want to talk about that because your story is also the story of Forest Park.
Yes.
Can you introduce for me a little bit more of how you're part of Forest Park's history, but also how you, Mr. McGriff, are part of Forest Park's history?
I'll be happy to address the initiation of the housing services function that he served as the first officer to enforce. And that was in 77. In 73, there was a lot of activity that was discriminatory, in our view, toward black potential homeowners by steering them into certain neighborhoods and whites away from certain neighborhoods. That was a violation of federal fair housing legislation that was passed in 1968. And our city passed its own version of that kind of civil rights legislation in the form of a 1973 Fair Housing Act, which included a portion establishing a housing commission and an office for a housing services officer, which was a function that Mr. McGriff was recruited to enforce.
And you were the first person to come fill that position. There's another first about your position at the City of Forest Park that you just talked about, I think.
Yes.
And tell us what that is too.
Well, the 1973 Fair Housing legislation was followed in 1976 by an affirmative action ordinance of the city. which said that we should seek to diversify our employee base. And a year later, we took advantage of that legislation.
That's excellent. I just want to call those things to mind because we take for granted, I think now, in Forest Park, what we have. It's a very diverse area, and it's something that we're very used to. But that was because of intentional decisions that were made during the founding, and those are things that you're part of. So that's the reason I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to mention that. Talk about what that was like when you were here to begin your role in that position.
Very interesting that I was asked to organize a type of program that would include both whites and blacks at the same time and try to maintain the properties that were established. But at that particular time, redlining and housing discrimination was running rapid. So to make a long story short, I was asked to try to, there was 19,000 residents at the time. The city was growing. What they really didn't want to do was to reintegrate. Blacks were moving in and whites were moving out, so to speak. It was a white flight type of situation, and it had to be managed in certain ways. And because of the ordinances that had been passed by the city, I was given the authority or the responsibility at the time to try to generate whatever was needed to justify and to try to maintain while upgrade the properties in the city at the time.
And what about Forest Park did you find were things that brought people to the community as you were working with families and bringing them in and keeping other families here? What were some of the things about?
Well, at the time is the availability of fair and good residence and housing. And I'm assuming at the time too, no one wanted to live in a segregated community. Throughout the Ohio area, there were segments of not racial discrimination, but just housing discrimination. And just so happened Forest Park had the idea that they wanted to maintain an integrated community and to do it fairly and honestly.
So you moved here with little girls.
Yes, I did. Well, one was born just as I was leaving Forest Park, but go right ahead.
What about, well, I was just wondering, what about having kids growing up in Forest Park, and the same thing for you, Brendan? Did you like about them growing up here?
I was ecstatic at the opportunities that they were provided and were able to obtain and achieve. Yeah, both of my girls are doing quite well now. Both of them came out of the Forest Park school system. One's a pediatric dentist, and the other is a full bird colonel in the United States Army, working in the Pentagon currently.
Full colonel.
Yeah, full bird colonel. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful.
That's our legacy, Forest Park. This is who
happen.
our kids grow up to
It
be.
can
That's
happen.
fantastic.
Yep.
How about you?
Yes, I had already, upon arrival in 1964, a family that included 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. As a matter of fact, they all went into education afterwards, and they are now still employed as educators, and they were happy to have the opportunity to see diversity as it evolved.
In your time as counsel and working and living in Forest Park, are there specific stories that you hope younger current residents, they get to know, they can be proud of? This is my city. My city was part of this project.
Well, I have expressed the interest as of the 1970s already that we wanted to, if we could, as I began to serve the city as a elected council member, aim to become a stably integrated community, which would have been at that time, unheard of. And so if we could stem the tide of resegregation resulting from housing practices, real estate practices that were popular before the civil rights legislation of '68. If we could get enough interest in the local real estate industry to reform their practices, then we would be able to achieve stable integration. And so, in fact, we had to retain as a city the services of the Housing Opportunities Made Equal Agency, which did testing of real estate companies as to their practices. And in fact, practices of a number of agencies, and in particular, the one that was doing the most business in the northern suburbs, had to be sued over their discriminatory practices and taken to court.
And that's something that, again, current residents knowing that this intentional action was taking place to create this community, it didn't accidentally grow up to be a place with such a large distribution of people from everywhere. And that, as we look at anniversary year, that's one of the things that the city celebrates.
Yes.
And so if we're going to celebrate it, I feel like we should talk about how it got that way.
Mr. McGriff actually collected some of the data about how patterns were being developed within the city. Pocketing of certain neighborhoods reflected discriminatory practices by the real estate agents involved. So he was a part of collecting the data to present in court.
It wasn't about me, it was about the community at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm a very proud citizen and will maintain residency as long as I live.
I'm curious, are you in the same house you
Oh yeah, the one we bought.
started
Yeah.
out at?
Yeah. You can't burn me out of that.
When you moved here, it was still new. It was still creating a welcoming
It was under
community.
development,
What was it like to move here with your family?
Well, as I said, white flight was running rampant. The real estate industry was just redlining all over the place. It was something that had to be addressed, or we would have ended up being an segregated community. But the council got a hand on it early, and everybody decided that here's the direction in which we want to take, and use whatever force was necessary to maintain and upgrade. And that was just my philosophy, Let me help any resident, black or white, to maintain the property that you have purchased, and while upgrading as a community in the same fashion. So it was a challenge.
As you look back over the time and as you look out in your neighborhood now, do you feel like that's...
Oh, I'm very, very proud of what we've accomplished, and that the city is still working toward maintaining an integrated community. And no one wants to be forced into an area in which they are not comfortable. But the development and the residential options that a resident has now is just whatever you choose and wherever you choose, you can live and live comfortably. And in this city, that's a standard.
When I moved in 1964 with my family of 3 children and a spouse, we started in rental property because I had only just finished schooling and I wasn't able to afford anything more substantial. So we rented property, but in '68, we actually had enough income and paid off enough of our debts to start a project to build our own home. So we left the part of the city we started at and moved to a different one, between which times the first blacks came into Cincinnati under protest of neighbors in their surroundings, with one exception. That one exception was a city leader who subsequently became a council member, and she also was a woman who started the program for youth in the Knights of Columbus building called the Cellar, which is a youth activity center in 19-something 70s. But in the 60s, she already felt so concerned about the whiteness of the whole community, that she encouraged this black family to move into Forest Park in her neighborhood and found a home for them and helped them survive and get to understand and accept some of the racial epithets expressed toward them in that neighborhood, which was an act of courage on their part, but also on the part of the sponsor of this family, the person who subsequently became a council member in a council that I served on. And she went to a church that I attended at that time myself. So we were acquainted from the beginning.
So let's name names. Who is this person that was?
Her name is Lynn Ashley.
Okay,
That's
okay.
right. Yeah, she was the one that got me going. She actually got me going.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, she was something special,
Yeah.
and with an attitude that became motivation
Yes.
for a resolution
Yes,
that
she
was
was.
presented to the city council in 1968, the same year that federal legislation was passed, a resolution called Operation Welcome, which was turned down by the city council that was sitting in a position to decide matters like that at the time. So we had an all-white community in 65, and then we had a very conservative anti-integration council in 68.
So what was the pivoting that turned that around, that made it more welcoming? That first family did not really get to move into the diverse, welcoming community that we know as Forest Park today.
No.
So that changed. What changed that?
Well, from a personal perspective, a lot was going on at the in the company where I worked, which had a program called Black-White Awareness, and they were teaching employees how to understand the cultural differences and how to help overcome opposition. Because this company wanted to have a diverse workforce from the time the legislation was passed
Okay.
by the Congress. And so they were a good neighbor company, employing a lot of people in the area. And that corporate posture was a contributor, not the turning point. The real turning point came when an African American was elected on council by an overwhelming majority of the voters that year. The year that we had our first black candidate for council was 79, and that person got more votes than two other candidates who were elected with him on a platform called Forest Park 2000. He had enough votes in excess of what they had for him to be entitled to become the first black mayor. That was the practice in those days, and still is in the city of Forest Park. The
Okay.
person who gets the most votes in a given election has the privilege of right of first refusal. This person was of such a graceful demeanor that he said he didn't want to be mayor yet, if ever, because he was just so totally inexperienced. And the city was, in fact, undergoing turmoil at that time. This was now 2 years after Will had been retained to be
Okay.
our housing services officer. So there was a revolution occurring, and this was a turning point, but not one that this newcomer was prepared to engage in the hands-on method that was needed.
I'm just going to take a brief moment too of things that we can extrapolate too much to now, I think, from history, but there's some things we can pull out. The business community had a tremendous impact on that. And I don't know that they think of that when we look at the business community of Forest Park, if they're aware that if you want to be if you want to see a better community for your business to be in, to be part of that.
Right.
And that was, as you said, that was a key part of that. And we're looking at local elections right now. Right now, there are
Yes.
Forest Park council members up for election.
Yes.
This was a key moment in the founding of Forest Park, and that makes Forest Park what it is.
Yes.
And you know what made that happen? Local elections.
Yes.
People, we
Yes.
talk an awful lot about what happens at the national level and maybe the state level. Commercial stations can focus on that
Right.
and get the biggest viewership. But if you're a Forest Park resident and you think it doesn't matter to pay attention to your local council elections, well, it sure mattered
Yeah.
in 1979. That
It did,
really
it did,
mattered.
it did.
So
Made the
I'm
difference.
that's a little takeaway that I really want to make sure that we hit.
Made the
Okay.
difference.
Along the lines of the historical evolution into a welcoming community, we seemed to have been welcoming sufficiently to a person who subsequently became the chief executive officer of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. His name was Ed Rigaud, and he was elected to our city council in 1979, which became the first black council member in any suburb in the area.
Really.
I think it was two of our council members ultimately served in the Ohio House of Representatives. One of them, another member, was elected county recorder. So there was a civic servant development program out of what we were doing. We had also had the first female African-American mayor of our city,
Yes.
of any city in the area. Her name was Kathy Barrett. She's one of the ones that went to the House of Representatives after being mayor. Another one is the current county
That's
commissioner,
what she was thinking of.
Stephanie Summerall Dumas was a mayor also, but not the first black female mayor. Kathy Barrett was 10, maybe 15 years previously.
You are now the sitting president of the Forest Park
That's
Historical
correct,
Society.
that's correct.
And you are
A
the
sitting member.
sitting member, lifetime member.
Lifetime member.
I have just learned.
Thank you.
And so you have far more information than we could possibly chat about in a short studio chat. How can folks get involved and get connected when they want to know more?
Well, we've recorded many of the episodes of things that were a part of growing up in the form of PowerPoint presentations, and we've been holding monthly meetings and showing those PowerPoints to whoever wishes to attend. We have a membership that's a mailing list that has 36 names or thereabouts on it, and 10 or 12 of them show up for every meeting. And so the PowerPoint presentations that have been collected and presented over the last now 3 years, when we reinitiated our practices doing that and presenting meetings, those are available.
Excellent. And you've brought in a couple documents.
I did.
These I kind of don't want to give them back to you until I have a chance to read them because they look fantastic. A brief history of Forest Park, Ohio. This looks like it was put together in 2011.
Correct.
And then a really extensive seminar document here, Community and Transition, Forest Park.
Yes.
How can folks read these if they're interested in that?
They're not online at the moment, but copies or PDFs can be sent to email addresses. That's how low tech we are presently, I'm sorry to say. We're working forward to get more sophisticated. I have to tell you, one of the things of which I'm supremely proud was not a PowerPoint. It was actually an in-person visit by Leslie Edwards, the now deceased Tuskegee Airman, who came as my invitation to one of our meetings because he and I wound up attending the same church for a year or two before he died, actually 5 years before he died. And I got to know him and share interests that we had in common. One of them, though, was, though he didn't live here in Forest Park, the recollection he had of the reputation of the city as the most welcoming community in all the area, to such a degree that when he gave his presentation about his own recollections of growing up in northern Hamilton County, he remembered Forest Park as the thing, he said, that Tuskegee Airmen gave their life for.
Oh, wow.
The kind of community where acceptance wasn't pushed on anybody, it was available.
Is there anything in particular? Because I feel like we can't cover too much more
Okay.
with a quick chat, but I want to make sure that we have a chance for you to tell anything particular that you would like the residents to know.
I'm thinking that the
Thanks.
city of Forest Park can face the future with the attitude of change for the better currently.
We've just been informed of the population figures for the last census, and Forest Park grew. For the first time in our history, we exceeded 20,000 residents. We had never previously
19 when we started.
been above 20,000, and that made us a more populous city than Norwood, which means we're now second place, and they've fallen beneath us. It's not exactly accurate to say it started with that vision. That vision evolved through a series of
legal actions.
legal actions, but also growth among the population away from illegal actions to restrict housing to people only of the color of the owners.
Yeah, that's something really for the city to be proud of, and for you to be proud of that. It's part of that. You were part of what made that happen. That the Forest Park that we're looking at right now is that way because of the work and the intentional work that you did.
Of the residents.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and you're right, and of all the
And the
residents.
residents. Right?
I want to highlight what you did, but you're right. It was an effort of everyone who also became part of that vision and said, no, we're going to continue to be intentional about this. We like what we're doing here. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I want to thank you again for being here in the studio. Anyone who is interested in learning more about the history of Forest Park, as we are growing and becoming part of the future history of Forest Park, make sure that you check out those history meetings. You make sure that you can request these documents to learn more of the details of the history, and be proud that this is the history of the city where you are now.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.